The late morning sun reflected softly off the polished glass doors of Summit Trust Bank, casting golden streaks across the granite steps as Grace Thompson approached. At 75, her movements were careful but deliberate. Her grey curls were tucked neatly beneath a straw hat, and her floral dress hung modestly beneath a beige cardigan. Nothing about her appearance drew attention, exactly how she wanted it. She carried a worn leather handbag that had seen better days, and on her left hand was the only piece of jewelry she wore, a gold wedding band that glinted faintly with each step. Grace had chosen her outfit thoughtfully, not to impress, but to be underestimated. "Let's see what you're really made of," she murmured to herself, echoing the words of her late husband Thomas, a man who had once believed that character was revealed not in boardrooms, but in how people treated those with no status to offer in return. The interior of Summit Trust was designed to dazzle. Soaring ceilings, rich mahogany paneling, and gleaming marble floors created a space that whispered wealth and security. Grace's sensible shoes tapped softly as she made her way to the reception desk. The young woman seated behind it offered a rehearsed, professional smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I assist you today?" Grace returned the smile with a warmth that felt genuine. "I'm hoping to speak with someone about a personal loan," she said. "Nothing big, just enough to help my granddaughter get her bakery off the ground. She's very talented, but space downtown is so expensive these days." The receptionist's smile flickered ever so slightly, just enough for Grace to notice the brief recalibration in the woman's gaze, an internal judgment forming. "Of course," the receptionist replied after a pause, her eyes briefly scanning the glass-walled offices behind her. "Let me see who's available." She picked up the desk phone, speaking in a low voice. "Mr. Daniels, there's an elderly woman here, inquiring about a personal loan." Another short pause followed, then she replaced the receiver. "Mr. Eric Daniels, our branch manager, is available. He'll see you now. Last door on the left." Grace gently patted the young woman's hand and offered a quiet thank you before making her way down the corridor. Behind her calm demeanor, her mind was already working, taking in the structure of the office, the demeanor of the staff, and the tone of service delivery, details that might have escaped someone less seasoned. As she walked, Grace took note of the subtle cues around her, sleek corporate artwork, slogans etched in glass about innovation and trust, but nothing that spoke to service or community. It was a display meant to impress, to suggest prestige, but Grace had spent her life in the world of finance and knew well that appearances often masked uncomfortable truths. At the end of the hallway, through the glass of the corner office, she saw a sharply dressed man rise from his desk. Eric Daniels, early 40s, exuded the kind of practiced charisma that had likely propelled his rapid ascent through the banking world. His suit was tailored to perfection, his tie likely cost more than Grace's entire wardrobe, and his smile, as she would soon discover, was something closer to performance than sincerity. He stepped around the desk and held the door open as Grace approached. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Eric Daniels, branch manager. Please, come in and make yourself comfortable." Grace entered with a polite nod, easing herself slowly into the leather chair across from him. She placed her handbag on her lap, folding her hands over it. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she said. "My name is Grace Thompson." Eric flashed a grin. "Not at all, Mrs. Thompson. At Summit Trust, we pride ourselves on being accessible to our community, especially our seniors," he added, with a touch of performative empathy that Grace recognized instantly. She offered a soft smile, her eyes drifting around the office. A large photo of a happy family, clearly stock photography, sat on his desk, along with awards for sales volume and customer acquisition. To someone unfamiliar with financial language or power dynamics, Eric's space might have seemed professional, even welcoming. But Grace saw through it all, the curated charm, the subtle dominance of posture, the way he steered the atmosphere of the room without giving much away. This was not a place designed to serve, it was a place designed to sell. And now she was the product's next target. Still, Grace kept her demeanor gentle, her tone grateful, even as she absorbed every detail. "I've never done anything like this before," she said, with a soft, breathy laugh. "But my granddaughter's dream matters to me. And sometimes, when life has given you a little extra time, you realize it's worth using that time to lift someone else." Eric nodded, already crafting his pitch, unaware that the woman sitting across from him held more power than anyone in that building, and that he was the one being watched. Eric Daniels had always considered himself a man of numbers, sales figures, performance metrics, conversion ratios. He understood the corporate ladder intimately and had climbed it faster than most, not by fostering loyalty or practicing integrity, but by mastering manipulation. His strategy was simple: target the vulnerable, package profit as assistance, and deliver results that made executives nod approvingly from glass towers above. Sitting across from Grace Thompson, Eric saw not a person, but potential. Her grey hair, the subtle shake in her hand, the mention of a granddaughter's bakery dream, it all screamed easy mark. She was exactly the kind of customer he could wrap in a ribbon of fake concern and walk straight into one of his infamous Senior Advantage loans. A few more sign-ups like her, and the regional director position, along with a hefty bonus, would be his. He leaned forward with a practiced smile, pulling out his sleek tablet. "Mrs. Thompson, I think we may have just the perfect solution for you," he said, tapping through a series of screens. Charts and forms popped up, filled with numbers, percentages, and footnotes in text far too small for most eyes to read comfortably. "This is our Summit Senior Advantage package," he explained with deliberate ease, "designed specifically for clients like you, people helping their families, wanting simple, stress-free financing without all the red tape." It sounded thoughtful, generous even. But Grace noticed the speed with which he skipped over the terms, the way his fingers glided past the sections labeled collateral agreement, variable APR, and early repayment adjustment. Grace adjusted her reading glasses and leaned forward, appearing confused. "Oh my, that's quite a lot of information," she said softly, squinting at the screen. "It's hard to keep up with all the financial changes these days." Eric nodded sympathetically, concealing the satisfaction rising in his chest. That was the sweet spot, uncertainty laced with trust. "Don't worry about the fine print," he said reassuringly. "I'll walk you through everything. This plan skips the complicated application requirements. No need for your granddaughter to submit detailed business projections or jump through credit checks. We just need a bit of collateral, like your home, just for formalities, and we're good to go." Grace blinked, feigning concern. "My house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just as security," Eric replied smoothly. "Standard practice. Nothing to worry about." As he continued explaining, his tone remained warm but condescending. He described the initial interest rate, 17.9%, as competitive, carefully avoiding any mention of the post-introductory rate spike. He referred to the 10% early payoff penalty as a minor adjustment, and the arbitration clause that stripped customers of their legal rights as standard legal language. The more he talked, the more Grace saw through the cracks. The stock photo on his desk, the trophy shelf of sales awards, the absence of any community recognition, all of it formed a portrait of a man who didn't care about people, only profit. Yet she nodded, her eyes wide and trusting, the picture of a doting grandmother overwhelmed by financial jargon. Eric sensed he was closing in. He leaned back, satisfied, thinking he had control of the moment. "This kind of opportunity doesn't last long, Mrs. Thompson," he added, subtly increasing the pressure. "That bakery spot on Maple Street will be gone within the week, and our promotional rate package expires tomorrow. I'd hate for your granddaughter to miss out because of delays." Grace offered a gentle smile, her fingers lightly brushing the worn edges of her handbag. "That does sound urgent," she said, pausing just long enough to appear flustered. "And I do want to help her. She's worked so hard." Inside, however, she was documenting every tactic: urgency, confusion, charm, misdirection. It was a textbook pitch designed to overwhelm and disarm. Through it all, Grace never broke character. She asked questions like, "Is that 17? 9% a good number? And what happens if my granddaughter pays early?" Each time, Eric answered with vague reassurances and rapid deflections, confident that he'd already won her over. But behind her glasses, Grace's sharp eyes missed nothing. She noted the moment his patience wavered, the flicker of irritation when she asked to take the documents home, the tightness in his jaw when she hesitated to sign. She watched him closely, knowing the longer he talked, the more rope he handed her. Eric Daniels believed he was the one running the meeting, orchestrating the outcome. But in truth, he was the one walking straight into a carefully laid trap. As Grace sipped the last of her tea, she watched Eric excuse himself under the pretense of taking a quick call. "Pardon me just a moment, Mrs. Thompson," he said with that same artificial smile, sliding out of the office before she could respond. The door clicked shut behind him, but the glass panel allowed her a clear view of his silhouette as he approached a younger employee just outside. The two men exchanged a glance, and then Eric leaned in, chuckling as he mimicked her earlier posture. Shoulders hunched, hand trembling, voice mockingly high-pitched. "Oh my, that interest rate seems so high," he whispered, with exaggerated drama. The younger man laughed nervously, unsure whether to play along. Grace remained seated, the same serene expression on her face, but inside, her pulse was steady and alert. She reached slowly into her handbag and tapped her phone's screen, initiating a voice recording app she had installed years ago, for moments exactly like this. Through the pain, she couldn't hear every word, but she didn't need to. Eric's mocking body language and smug demeanor told the story clearly enough. He leaned against the counter, gesturing back toward his office with a smirk, proud of himself for having cornered another clueless senior. The younger employee, likely new or simply intimidated, offered weak chuckles in response, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of complicity. Eric's laughter, though muted by the glass, was sharp and joyless. It wasn't about humor. It was about dominance, about celebrating what he believed was a win. He had no idea the sweet old woman seated just a few feet away was recording every visible movement, collecting not only evidence but insight into the bank's internal culture and his own unguarded arrogance. Inside the office, the silence settled thick around Grace like a curtain. She glanced around again, this time not just observing but evaluating. On Eric's bookshelf, trophies gleamed under the halogen lights, plaques for top salesman Q2, framed certificates for exceeding quota, and a small bronze statue etched with pinnacle performer. Not a single award referenced customer service, community impact, or ethical excellence. Behind his desk, a framed quote read in bold silver font, "Success is seized, not given." It was meant to be motivational, but to Grace, it confirmed everything she suspected. This was a man who viewed life as a competition and people as leverage. She scanned the rest of the room and found it sterile and transactional. No photos of local events, no thank you notes from families, no partnership recognitions with neighborhood organizations. Just pure, unfiltered ambition dressed in corporate polish. She noticed the absence of anything human in the decor. No sign of empathy, no mention of charity work, not even a community bulletin board. Instead, the walls were covered in slick marketing materials promoting Summit Trust's premium investment tiers, complete with stock imagery of smiling retirees. Grace studied each element with surgical precision. This office, like the man who ran it, was curated for impression, not impact. Every inch of the space was built to seduce customers into trust, only to guide them gently toward exploitation. The more she looked, the more clearly she saw the disconnect between the bank's public persona and the private intentions of its representatives. When Eric finally returned, his smile had widened, buoyed by self-satisfaction. "Sorry about that, Mrs. Thompson," he said breezily, not realizing the remnants of mockery still clung to his voice. "Now, where were we?" Grace offered her softest smile yet, folding her hands politely. "We were just discussing my granddaughter's bakery," she said, with deliberate calm, "and your very helpful offer." Eric nodded enthusiastically, unaware that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. He believed he still held the upper hand, that the meeting was unfolding in his favor. Grace, meanwhile, tucked her phone deeper into her handbag, the recording still running, the truth still being captured, moment by moment, word by word. As he resumed his pitch, weaving confusion into comfort, Grace's thoughts wandered, not in distraction, but in reflection. How many others had sat in this chair before her? How many seniors had walked in hopeful and walked out burdened by fine print they never fully understood? She thought of her late husband, Thomas, and how outraged he would have been to see this kind of predatory behavior masked as professionalism. But Grace wasn't just angry, she was prepared. With every passing second, she gathered more than just audio. She gathered the full measure of a man who mistook cruelty for competence and age for ignorance. And now, as the final pieces of her quiet investigation began to fall into place, she knew with absolute certainty. This wasn't just about her granddaughter's bakery anymore. It was about the integrity of the institution her husband helped build and the reckoning that was coming. Eric Daniels glanced at the sleek watch on his wrist, a subtle power move meant to signal urgency. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice wrapped in gentle insistence. "I know this may seem like a lot to consider, but I must be transparent with you. The Summit Senior Advantage offer is being phased out. In fact, this is one of the last days it's available." He tapped a few keys on his tablet and swiveled the screen toward Grace, displaying a promotional banner in bold red text. "Limited time only." "These things come down from corporate with very little notice," he added with a helpless shrug, as though he too was a victim of the ticking clock. Grace leaned in, appearing both concerned and overwhelmed. "Oh my," she whispered, "that's unfortunate timing." She adjusted her glasses again, as if struggling to keep up with the information, a performance so convincing that even Eric, for all his practiced manipulation, took the bait. "This is exactly why I want to help you today," Eric continued smoothly. "The last thing I'd want is for your granddaughter to lose that bakery space because we didn't act quickly enough. I've seen too many good people miss out because they waited a day too long." He pulled a pen from the drawer and placed it gently beside the paperwork in front of her. "We can get this submitted right now and have the funds available by the end of the week. All I need is your signature here and here." Grace stared down at the dense documents, pretending to process the endless blocks of text. She noted the high 17.9% interest rate nestled among technical language. Even more concerning, she found a clause about a 10% early repayment fee, masked under the term adjustment. Her finger hovered over it. "This part here," she said softly. "What does this mean, exactly?" Eric barely glanced at the section. "Oh, that's just standard industry language. It only comes into play if someone pays off the loan early, and even then, it's minimal. Most people never even notice it." His tone was dismissive, as if her curiosity was an inconvenience. "The important thing is getting that location secured before another buyer moves in. The downtown area is hot right now." He swiped to the next screen, careful to breeze past a paragraph that allowed the bank to call the loan in full within 30 days if they deemed it necessary. "We almost never use that clause," he added casually. "It's just a formality. Every loan has its legal bits and pieces, but I assure you, this is a great opportunity, especially for someone in your position." Grace nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "It's just that I was always taught to read what I sign. My husband, rest his soul, used to say that a contract you don't understand is a contract you shouldn't sign." Her voice cracked slightly, adding a layer of emotional vulnerability. Eric softened his voice. "I completely understand, Mrs. Thompson. I admire your caution. But sometimes hesitation means losing out. If you leave today without signing, there's no guarantee this package or this rate will still be available tomorrow." He pushed the pen slightly closer. "You'd be doing this for your granddaughter. I'm sure she'll be grateful for your support." But Grace wasn't buying the urgency. She was documenting it. She noted how Eric redirected every concern toward emotional leverage, using her granddaughter's dream as both bait and guilt trip. She noticed how he used words like standard, minimal, and formality to gloss over clauses that could put her home at risk, and she paid close attention to how he avoided specifics about the variable interest rate after the 6-month mark. "Mr. Daniels," she said after a pause, "would it be all right if I took these home to review them with my granddaughter? I want to be sure I understand before signing anything." Her voice remained gentle, her posture hesitant, but her eyes, behind the lenses, were laser-sharp. Eric's expression faltered for the first time. A flicker of annoyance passed through his features before he caught it. "Well," he said, drawing out the word, "normally these documents aren't supposed to leave the branch. They contain proprietary terms that competitors would love to get their hands on." He laughed lightly, though it lacked sincerity. "But I suppose I can have my assistant make you a copy. Just remember, this is a time-sensitive offer. If you walk out without signing today, we'll have to start the application process all over again. That could take weeks." Grace smiled faintly. "I understand. I just want to do the right thing. For Sarah." She placed her hand gently on the document stack, neither accepting nor rejecting it. She could feel Eric's frustration rising under his composed exterior. While Eric stepped out to instruct his assistant to prepare the copies, Grace reached into her handbag and stopped the recording app, saving the audio file with a quiet tap. Her expression never changed. To anyone watching, she was still the delicate grandmother trying to understand a complicated world. But in her mind, the pieces were falling into place. She had recorded the pressure tactics, the misleading assurances, and the urgency meant to rush someone into a bad deal. And most importantly, she had witnessed firsthand how Summit Trust, at least at this branch, measured its success not by service, but by how well it could conceal the truth. Eric Daniels thought the game was his to win, but Grace Thompson was not playing his game. She was writing the rules to a different one, and he was already losing. When Eric returned to his office with a manila envelope containing the printed loan documents, the smile he'd worn earlier had thinned noticeably. His brow held a faint line of tension now, his movements just slightly quicker and less graceful. "Here we are," he said, placing the envelope on the desk with a soft thud. "Everything you asked for. But just to reiterate, this offer won't last. I'd hate to see your granddaughter miss her chance." Grace offered a polite nod, but made no move for the pen he pushed toward her again. Instead, she gently opened the folder and began leafing through the documents, her eyes moving slowly over the lines of small print. The room filled with silence, not the comfortable kind, but the brittle, charged kind that sharpens every glance and magnifies every breath. "I do have a few more questions," Grace said, adjusting her glasses. "This clause here, it says the bank can demand full repayment within 30 days at its discretion. What circumstances would cause that?" Eric's smile vanished completely. "That's just legal boilerplate," he said quickly, his tone tightening. "It's never used unless there's suspected fraud or extreme delinquency." Grace tilted her head slightly. "And this section? It says property seizure can happen without a court order. That feels alarming." Eric's eyes narrowed, and the polished mask he had worn for the past hour began to crack. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice firmer now, "I've explained all of this. These are standard practices in the industry. There's no need to get bogged down in the legalese." His irritation surfaced fully when Grace pointed to another clause. "And arbitration. You mentioned it earlier, but this says all disputes have to go through the bank's chosen arbitrator. That would make it difficult for a borrower to seek outside legal help, wouldn't it?" Eric exhaled loudly through his nose, standing up abruptly. "Look, I've spent a lot of time preparing this offer for you. It's not typical to get this level of flexibility or attention without an appointment, let alone with no prior relationship with the bank. If you don't feel comfortable moving forward, that's your decision, but I'm trying to help you here." He jabbed a finger at the paperwork. Most people would be grateful for this kind of opportunity. The calm pitchman had been replaced by someone harder, more impatient, someone who didn't like losing control. Just then, a soft knock interrupted the moment. Eric's assistant, Rachel, peeked into the room, her tablet in hand. "Mr. Daniels, sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Harper is still on hold regarding those overdraft charges. He says it's urgent." Eric turned on her like a switchblade. "I said I wasn't to be disturbed," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make Rachel flinch. "Tell him I'll call back when I'm done here. Unless you'd like to explain to this customer why her granddaughter won't get the loan because of your poor time management." Rachel's cheeks flushed red as she retreated, murmuring an apology and closing the door quietly behind her. Grace, watching the entire exchange, noted every detail. The shift in tone, the fear in Rachel's posture, the sudden drop in morale visible even through the glass. Eric turned back to Grace, trying to regain his earlier charm, but it was too late. The room had changed. The energy had changed. Grace closed the envelope gently, folding her hands over it. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Daniels," she said evenly. "This has certainly given me a lot to think about." Eric's frustration boiled just beneath the surface. "Think quickly," he said through clenched teeth. "This won't be here tomorrow, and I doubt your granddaughter wants to miss out because you got cold feet." Grace stood slowly, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her cardigan. "Sometimes, Mr. Daniels, hesitation is not fear. It's wisdom." Her voice remained soft, but there was steel beneath it, the kind that comes only from experience and certainty. With the documents tucked securely into her handbag, Grace walked to the door without another word. Behind her, Eric stood frozen, watching his sure-thing client disappear with all the paperwork and none of the signatures. What he didn't realize was that Grace had gathered everything she needed. Not just the printouts, but the tone, the tactics, the treatment, the recorded audio, the threats, the pressure, and the performance. As she stepped into the marble-floored hallway of Summit Trust Bank, she moved like any other elderly customer heading home from a day of errands. But inside, she carried something far more potent than a loan application. She carried the truth. And with that, the stage was set for what would come next. The front door of Summit Trust Bank swung gently closed behind Grace, but she didn't walk far. Instead, she stepped to the side and pretended to rummage through her handbag, glancing around the polished lobby as if she were searching for something she'd misplaced. The receptionist was busy with another client, and no one seemed to notice as she quietly retraced her steps along the corridor. She paused outside Eric Daniels' office, just far enough to avoid being seen, and retrieved her phone once more. With practiced ease, she tapped the record button and slid the device back into her pocket, its mic angled perfectly toward the slightly ajar door. From inside, Eric's voice rang out, no longer sweetened for customer interaction, but raw, arrogant, and unfiltered. "Another one," he said with a smirk. "Ripe for the picking." Grace heard the distinct clink of glass, followed by the sound of liquid being poured. It was barely noon, and he was already pouring himself a drink, likely from the small bar cart she'd seen earlier behind his desk. "Did you hear the way she talked about interest rates?" Eric continued, clearly addressing someone in the room. "Like it's still the 1960s. These seniors don't know what day it is half the time, and they'll sign anything if you make it sound like you're doing them a favor." His laugh was sharp, careless. "We've increased revenue by 42% just from targeting fixed-income retirees. They either can't pay and we get the property, or they pay early and we hit them with penalties. It's a win-win." A second voice entered, quieter, more hesitant. It was Rachel, his assistant. Her tone was restrained, almost like someone bracing herself before walking into traffic. "But some of them don't really understand the documents, Eric," she said. "That older woman today, Grace, she asked good questions. She actually read the clauses." Eric scoffed. "Please, she barely knew what she was reading. That's the beauty of the Senior Advantage package. It's profitable because they can't follow the fine print. Legal makes sure the language is airtight, and we push just hard enough to make it feel like a limited-time miracle." He took another sip, sighing contentedly. "They all come back. They always do. Desperate to help a grandkid or pay off some old debt. It's almost too easy." Ah, there was a long silence, broken only by the faint hum of air conditioning. Then Rachel spoke again, her voice different now, lower, emotional. My grandmother lost her house, she said. After my grandfather died, a bank convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage. She didn't understand the terms. She thought it was safe. When she fell behind, they took it. She passed away a few months later, heartbroken, humiliated. Her words hovered in the air, weighty and real. But Eric didn't flinch. That's unfortunate, he said flatly. But sob stories don't pay the bills, Rachel. This is business. And if you want your bonus this quarter, you'd better start thinking like a closer, not a social worker. His chair creaked as he leaned back. Compliance is for losers who can't close deals. Grace stood in the hallway, every nerve in her body alert, but her face composed. Through the narrow opening of the door, she could see Rachel standing frozen, her eyes downcast and her hands tightly clutched around her tablet. Grace didn't need to see more. She'd heard everything she needed. Eric's voice was filled with the kind of contempt that came from years of treating people as numbers, especially the vulnerable ones he could manipulate. What struck her even more was Rachel's quiet sorrow, the guilt of complicity pressed against the fear of retaliation. Grace had spent decades in banking. She knew the culture, the games, the way good people often stayed silent because they felt trapped. But now she had evidence, not suspicion, not hearsay, hard, irrefutable proof of systemic abuse hiding in plain sight. With a steady hand, Grace stopped the recording and saved the file. Her face revealed nothing, but inside she was already planning her next move. This wasn't just about Eric Daniels anymore. It wasn't even about the Westfield branch. It was about every branch, every customer, every elderly person who had been bullied or misled under the guise of financial advice. Grace turned and walked calmly toward the main entrance, her handbag pressed gently against her side, the phone inside it, holding the story Eric never intended the world to hear. And soon, that story would find its audience. Because Grace Thompson hadn't come to the bank to borrow money, she'd come to reclaim justice. Grace didn't leave the bank right away. After capturing the damning recording, she circled back into the main lobby, pretending once again to search for something inside her handbag. Her movements were slow and deliberate. Each pause, each glance meant to buy her time. She approached the front desk with an air of mild confusion. "Excuse me, dear," she said to the receptionist with a warm smile. "I think I may have left my reading glasses in Mr. Daniels's office. Would it be all right if I waited until he's free?" The receptionist, likely too new to question anything, nodded politely and gestured toward the waiting area. As Grace took her seat, she noticed an older woman behind the teller line glance in her direction. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that would soon become something more. The teller's nameplate read Martha Jensen, and beneath it, in smaller script, were the words 30 years of service. Her movements were precise, practiced, not the nervous energy of someone new to the job, but the rhythm of someone who had seen everything. When her customer stepped away, Martha took a chance. She approached the waiting area casually, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "If Mr. Daniels offered you one of those senior packages, I'd advise taking a second opinion. Maybe even stop by the West Side branch. They're more transparent there." Grace tilted her head, appearing curious but not surprised. "That's very kind of you. I was starting to wonder if I was the only one with questions." Martha hesitated, glancing toward the security cameras, then leaned in slightly. "You're not, but not many of us can say anything and keep our jobs." Before Grace could respond, Rachel walked briskly from the hallway, her expression still unreadable. She spotted Grace and quickly adjusted her posture. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, voice formal but carrying an undertone, "did you find your glasses?" Grace smiled as she patted her bag. "Turns out they were right here all along," she replied, tapping the flap of the purse that still held her phone and the recorded evidence. Rachel hesitated, her lips parting as if to say something more, but then she caught sight of Eric moving in the far corridor and quickly shifted her tone. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to let us know. Grace reached out gently and placed a hand on Rachel's wrist, holding it just long enough to offer comfort. Actually, she said softly, there might be one more thing. Rachel looked at her, eyes searching. Grace lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Do you know who chairs the board of Summit Trust? I'd like to write a letter about my experience, just to make sure the right people hear about it. Rachel blinked, then glanced at Martha, who was now quietly organizing paperwork behind the teller counter within earshot. That would be Douglas Harding, technically, Rachel replied. But any letters to the board go through corporate communications. They decide what makes it to the directors. Grace nodded, as if that answer confirmed exactly what she expected. And if I wanted to ensure someone on the board actually read my letter? She asked. Rachel hesitated, then lowered her voice. There's someone who's been more involved lately, a board member named Eleanor Mason. She's not in the spotlight much, but I've heard she's the one who pushed for the ethics committee to be formed. Grace tucked that name away with quiet satisfaction. The clock was ticking, but the puzzle pieces were coming together. Between Rachel's guarded empathy and Martha's subtle warnings, Grace was beginning to see just how deep the rot went, and how long the branch employees had been silently enduring it. They weren't just witnesses to Eric's behavior, they were collateral damage. But now, with a little encouragement and a growing sense that someone was watching, they were starting to find their voices. It was subtle, it was cautious, but it was happening. And Grace knew from experience, that's how real change starts. Quietly, behind the scenes, when fear begins to loosen its grip. As she stood to leave, Grace turned one final time to Martha. Thank you for your honesty, she said. It makes all the difference. Martha smiled faintly and nodded. Be careful, she whispered. He's charming until he feels threatened. Grace nodded, her expression calm, composed. I've met men like him before. Lah! She adjusted the strap of her purse and made her way towards the exit, the sunlight outside casting long shadows across the lobby floor. But it wasn't just her shadow following her now. It was the weight of every voice that had been silenced, every signature gathered under pressure, every life disrupted by fine print no one had explained. Grace stepped into the sun, no longer just a quiet grandmother helping her granddaughter, but a strategist preparing to bring the truth to light. The top floor of Summit Trust Bank headquarters was a stark contrast to the branch Grace had visited just days earlier. Here, everything exuded polished wealth and corporate prestige, from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline to the mahogany-paneled boardroom with its long, gleaming table and pristine leather chairs. Today's meeting was scheduled to be routine, a promotion hearing for Eric Daniels, the man hailed by his superiors as a rising star. He had dressed the part, too, wearing a new charcoal-grey Armani suit, a platinum tie clip, and a grin that seemed glued in place. He greeted assistants outside the boardroom with casual confidence. Big day, he said with a wink. Let's go seal the deal. But as he stepped through the heavy doors into the boardroom, something shifted. 12 executives were already seated, their expressions unreadable. At the head of the table, however, the chair remained empty. Eric was halfway through his self-assured introduction when the doors opened behind him, and in walked Grace Thompson. Gone was the floral dress and cardigan. In their place was a tailored navy blue pantsuit, crisp and elegant, accented with a string of pearls and low heels that clicked authoritatively against the hardwood floor. Her silver hair was swept neatly into a chignon, and on her lapel was a discreet Summit Trust insignia. The room fell silent. Eric's mouth twitched as he tried to place the familiar face. His confusion turned to unease as she walked calmly to the head of the table and took the empty seat reserved for the board chair. Whispers stirred among the directors. Grace calmly opened a leather folder and looked up at the room. "Apologies for the delay," she said, her voice firm and poised. Traffic from the Riverside Ethics Summit was unusually heavy. The silence broke as the CEO, Charles Bennett, rose from his seat and extended a hand. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for joining us." Then, addressing the room, he added, For those of you who haven't had the pleasure, this is Grace Thompson, chairwoman of the board and majority shareholder of Summit Trust. Eric's face drained of color. He took a slow step backward, the reality of the situation catching up to him like a wave. "We've met," Grace said, her gaze locked on him. "Although I suspect Mr. Daniels didn't recognize me at the time." She slid the leather folder to the center of the table and opened it. "I recently visited the Westfield branch under the guise of a customer. I asked for a modest loan to help a fictional granddaughter. What I received in return was a sales pitch full of pressure, misleading terms, and dismissive responses to reasonable concerns." She lifted a document from the folder and passed it down the table. "This is the loan agreement, Mr. Daniels prepared for me. Please note the introductory interest rate of 17.9%, which jumps to 24.3% after 6 months. Also, a 10% early repayment penalty, an arbitration-only dispute clause, and a provision that allows the bank to call the loan due in full with 30 days' notice, without court intervention." As the board members read in growing disbelief, Grace removed her phone and placed it on the table. "But documentation alone isn't enough," she continued. "What I'm about to play is an audio recording captured during an unguarded moment just after Mr. Daniels believed our meeting had ended." She tapped the screen. Eric took a sharp breath. Eric's voice filled the boardroom, confident and smug. "They always come back. These seniors. They don't understand the terms. They just want to help their grandkids. We bury the fees in legal language. Either they default and we get the property, or they pay early and we hit them with penalties." A sharp silence fell as the recording continued. "Compliance is for losers. Sob stories don't pay the bills. These people are marks." The board sat frozen. Several members shifted in their chairs. One executive placed his pen down, jaw clenched. The CEO rubbed his temples. Eric's eyes darted from face to face, sweat breaking across his forehead. If I'd known who you were," he stammered. Grace cut him off. "That's precisely the point. You treated me the way you treat everyone you don't believe has power. That's the problem." Her voice didn't rise, but its weight filled the room. "Summit Trust was founded on integrity. My late husband believed that our success should be tied to our community's well-being, not extracted from its most vulnerable. What I experienced, and what this recording confirms, is a betrayal of that legacy." She closed the folder slowly. "This isn't just about one unethical loan. This is about a culture that rewards deception and punishes transparency. And if it happened to me, I must ask, how many others did not walk away in time?" Her gaze scanned the room, not in anger, but in challenge. "We must decide today what kind of institution we are, because the truth is no longer hidden." Around the table, no one spoke, but everyone knew this meeting would not be ending with a promotion. The silence that had descended upon the boardroom after Grace finished playing the recording wasn't just awkward, it was loaded. A heavy quiet that pulsed with disbelief, unease, and something deeper. The dawning realization that this wasn't an isolated case. Charles Bennett, Summit Trust's CEO, finally cleared his throat and looked across the table at the board. "Before we proceed," he said, "I believe there are others who should be heard." Grace gave a small nod, and at her signal, the doors at the back of the boardroom opened once more. 4 employees from the Westfield branch stepped in, among them Rachel, still visibly nervous but resolute, and Martha Jensen, the veteran teller. They were joined by 2 others, a young loan officer and a customer service rep, each of them walking with quiet determination, each of them carrying months, if not years, of untold stories. The employees took seats along the wall, avoiding eye contact with Eric, who sat frozen in disbelief at the far end of the table. It was Rachel who stood first. She stepped forward, holding a thick file folder. "This contains customer complaints that were never submitted to corporate," she said. "Mr. Daniels instructed us to filter out any that would affect his performance metrics." Her voice was shaky at first, but steadied with each word. "He had us mark them as resolved when they weren't, especially the ones from seniors who later defaulted." She placed the file before the board. Many of them were pressured into loans with the same terms you've just heard. Hidden penalties, inflated rates, and vague legal language that even I had trouble understanding. And I work here. Grace met Rachel's eyes and offered a silent nod of encouragement. Next, Martha spoke. In the past year, I've watched families walk in with hope and walk out with anxiety. Some of them came back weeks later, confused and scared, saying they didn't understand what they'd signed. One woman, widowed just 3 months, was pushed into refinancing her home just so her application looked stronger, even though she didn't need it. Her voice broke slightly. She was told it would help her son get a business loan. It didn't. She lost the house 6 months later. She paused, breathing in deeply. We tried to speak up, but Mr. Daniels made it clear that questioning his methods would be seen as insubordination. At the far end of the table, Eric's hands tightened around the armrests of his chair, his jaw locked in place. Then a young woman stood from the back, someone the board hadn't seen before. She looked barely 30, dressed simply in a blouse and slacks, her hands gripping a small photo. My name is Emily Harper, she said softly. My grandmother was one of your customers. Last year, she took out a loan from the Westfield branch, one of Mr. Daniels' packages. She thought she understood the terms. She didn't. Emily held up the photo. This is her in the house she raised me in. After the loan adjusted, the payments tripled. She couldn't keep up. She tried to fight, but the bank refused to renegotiate. One day she got a notice that the house would be foreclosed. 2 weeks later, she had a stroke. Her voice cracked. She died, thinking she had failed us, but she didn't. She was misled. Emily's words seemed to break something open in the room. Several board members now looked visibly disturbed, some flipping back through the documents in front of them, rereading the fine print with new eyes. Grace let the silence settle before stepping forward once again. She removed another file from her portfolio. This, she said, placing it on the table, is a loan product Eric Daniels engineered himself. It does not exist within any authorized Summit Trust policy framework. He created it by combining the most profitable and most harmful elements of several legitimate offerings. She opened the file and gestured to key clauses. This penalty structure, for instance, is taken from a commercial real estate agreement, not designed for individual borrowers. And this variable interest formula, it was pulled from an old line of credit document meant for risk-based lending, not family loans. Ah, she looked around the table, her voice steady but edged with fire. He created a hybrid product that was never approved, never reviewed by legal, and never disclosed to compliance. And then he marketed it to the people least likely to understand it. Grace paused, letting the weight of those words settle across the room. This isn't just unethical, it's predatory, and it has cost people their homes, their health, and their dignity. All eyes turned to Eric, who sat motionless, his earlier arrogance now crumbling under the weight of truth. Grace folded her hands and addressed the board. I ask you not to view this as an isolated event. I ask you to see it for what it is, a systemic failure and an opportunity to reclaim our values. The air in the room had changed. Justice had finally spoken, and it was only just beginning. A suffocating silence hung over the boardroom, thicker than before, more final. What had begun as a straightforward promotion hearing had unraveled into a full-scale reckoning. The folder of unauthorized loan documents lay open at the center of the table. The audio recording of Eric's mocking remarks still echoed in memory, and the testimonies, some trembling, some defiant, had pierced through the last defenses of corporate complacency. Eric Daniels sat rigid at the far end of the table, his once confident posture now reduced to a hollow stare. His eyes darted from one board member to the next, searching for even a flicker of sympathy. There was none. Charles Bennett, the CEO, looked up from the documents and cleared his throat. I believe we've heard enough, he said solemnly. It's time to move to a vote. Without hesitation, one of the senior directors spoke. I move that Eric Daniels be terminated from his position, effective immediately, for gross ethical misconduct, deception, and breach of trust. Another voice echoed firmly. Seconded. Grace nodded in approval and turned to the rest of the board. All those in favour, she asked. One by one, hands went up around the table, without pause, without doubt. 12 votes, unanimous. The motion carries, Grace said, her voice calm, clear, and final. Mr. Daniels, your employment with Summit Trust is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Eric's jaw dropped, but the words refused to come. For a moment, he looked as if he couldn't process what was happening, as if this entire moment were a mistake that could be reversed with a clever excuse. Then, just as quickly, his expression twisted into something else. Rage, desperation, disbelief. You can't do this, he barked, rising so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. I built this branch. I tripled our numbers. I made this bank more money than anyone in this room. His voice climbed with each word, face flushed red. You're making a mistake. You don't get to throw me away because of one loan. He turned toward Grace. You tricked me. You pretended to be some poor old lady. This is entrapment. You came in here looking to ruin me. Before Grace could respond, Charles Bennett stood and motioned toward the door. Security, he said simply. 2 uniformed guards appeared almost instantly, as if summoned by the building itself. Eric struggled as they approached, knocking over a chair in his flailing. This isn't over, he shouted. You're all cowards. You're going to regret this. You'll see. When your numbers fall, when this place collapses without me, you'll wish I was still here. His words grew hoarse as the guards took him by the arms. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't even stand. She simply watched, her eyes steady as stone. On the contrary, Mr. Daniels, she said, her voice smooth but resolute. This is exactly where it ends. Eric's voice became a distant echo as he was led from the boardroom, past rows of silent staff who had gathered near the elevators, drawn by the commotion. They watched him go, not with pity, but with quiet relief. When the doors finally closed behind him, Grace rose from her chair and turned back to the branch employees seated at the wall. What you did today took courage, she said, her tone softening. You spoke truth to power, and in doing so, you've helped us all see what needed to be seen. You've reminded this board, reminded me, of what Summit Trust was meant to be. She walked over and extended a hand to Rachel, who looked stunned but grateful. This company only thrives when its people are empowered to speak up. No more fear, no more silence. Then she turned to Martha, offering the same hand and a knowing smile. Thank you, for being the quiet voice of integrity when no one else would. As Grace looked around the room, she addressed everyone, not just those in suits, but those in uniforms, at desks, behind counters. Change begins today, she declared, and it will begin from the inside out. Every loan document will be reviewed, every complaint re-examined, every person wronged by these practices will be contacted. We will restore what was lost, not just in money, but in trust. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence filled with meaning, the kind that happens when something broken starts to mend. Grace stepped back to her seat, knowing her work was only beginning, but for the first time in years, the air inside Summit Trust smelled less like polish and paperwork, and more like truth. 2 weeks after the storm that shook Summit Trust to its core, the Westfield branch no longer felt like the same place. The tension in the air had lifted, replaced with something softer, more hopeful. The fear that once curled beneath each employee's smile had dissipated. The pressure to upsell, manipulate, or remain silent was gone. At the center of this transformation stood Rachel Porter, once an assistant shadowed by doubt and orders, now the newly appointed branch manager. Her promotion had taken her by surprise, but not Grace Thompson, who had seen in her the quiet conviction of someone built for leadership. With Rachel at the helm, the branch didn't just run, it flourished. Customer satisfaction climbed, walk-ins stayed longer, and more importantly, trust returned. Rachel's leadership style was rooted in listening. She held weekly staff meetings where every voice mattered. She restructured the loan advisory process to include transparency checkpoints, steps that ensured clients understood each term, each clause, each rate adjustment. She made sure Martha had a seat at every table. Under her watch, a new culture bloomed, one where employees no longer whispered warnings to customers under their breath, but offered guidance with clarity and pride. Clients came back, not out of desperation, but out of loyalty. For the first time in years, Summit Trust's Westfield branch wasn't a place people feared, they recommended it. The same customers who once felt taken advantage of now spoke openly about the changes, and word spread fast. Across town, a new bronze plaque was installed outside a small, bright building nestled between a local library and a community garden. The sign read, "The Thomas Harper Ethics Center, where integrity meets finance." Grace had funded the center herself, using a combination of personal assets and Summit Trust's restitution budget. It was named for two people, her late husband, Thomas, who had once founded the bank on principles of fairness and dignity, and Emily Harper's grandmother, whose life had been irreversibly affected by predatory lending. Inside the center, financial literacy classes were held weekly, free to the public. Seniors, single parents, immigrants, and first-time borrowers gathered to learn how to read loan documents, avoid high-risk clauses, and advocate for themselves. For Grace, it was both legacy and justice. She remained on the board, of course, still chairwoman, still the sharp mind behind policy reform, but much of her real work happened in places no one expected her to be. Grace resumed her undercover visits, trading in pearls and tailored suits for reading glasses and worn-out shoes. She visited different branches across the state, dressed as retirees, cafe owners, recently widowed spouses. She asked simple questions and observed the answers. She watched how employees treated the unseen, the unsure, the unprofitable. What she found, more often than not, was progress. But when she didn't, she made notes, quietly, firmly. The purpose of her work wasn't to catch people failing, it was to ensure no one forgot why Summit Trust existed in the first place. On one such visit, an elderly couple sat beside her in a waiting area. They were applying for their first joint account. The teller, newly hired, explained every detail of the paperwork in clear, patient language, pausing often to make sure they understood. Grace smiled to herself, knowing that moment, mundane as it may have seemed, was the real measure of success. Not quarterly profit, not headlines, but dignity in everyday interaction. Before leaving, she slipped a thank you card to the branch manager, signed only with a simple message. "You're doing it right. Keep going." She didn't need recognition. She didn't want credit. She wanted change. Real change. And that was happening. One conversation, one policy, one branch at a time. Back at her home, a small frame sat near the windowsill, a photo of Thomas beside a quote that read, "We succeed when others don't fear us." Grace kept fresh flowers in front of it, usually lilies, and every so often she'd sit with a cup of tea and reread the financial reports from each branch. Not for the numbers, but for the notes left by customers. They treated me like a person. I finally understood what I was signing. My grandmother would have been proud. Those were the lines that mattered now. Grace knew the work was far from over. Banking, like people, required constant tending. But as spring bloomed outside her window, she smiled, knowing that the institution she once feared had lost its soul, had begun to rediscover it. And so had she. If this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ, a channel dedicated to stories that reveal the truth beneath the surface. Every week, we uncover hidden injustices, quiet courage, and the power of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Share this video with someone who still believes in integrity, and leave a comment to let us know which moment spoke to you most. Your voice matters, and together we can inspire a culture of empathy, accountability, and change.